So we're at State of OpenCon 2025, run by OpenUK, and here we have Richard, head of open source at Ant Group. So how's your day been so far, the first day of SOOCon 2025?
Well, I mean, it's my first time here, so I would say that it's actually my first time to the UK. I would say that everything I saw was like fabulous. I was actually the speaker in the event in the morning. The audience was pretty engaging, and the venue is great. Yeah, like I actually love the square a lot.
Yes.
Outside of this building, I haven't really got a chance to check it. Maybe I'll do that afterwards. Yeah, but it has been a very welcoming event. I do meet a lot of old friends because I've been working open source for quite some time. So I do see a lot of old friends here.
And these old friends, are they like across borders? Are they all just from China, or are they across the world?
No. Yeah, I mean like, so for instance, I mean like my friends from the Rust Foundations, met friends from the Linux Foundations, and surprisingly also meet friends kind of travel all the way from the Canada and the US just joining this event. I was not expecting that. Another surprise which I had was like I was able to share stage with my previous employer, Square. Their OSPO leader also came in, and we're able to share stage today, and that was I would say a revelation moment I had. I was not expecting to meet someone from the States here. And it seems to be somewhere in the middle, right? we traveled about the same distance to meet in UK and sharing stages here. For that, I really appreciate the events and the opportunities we're able to connect the people here.
Awesome.
So you've mentioned that you've previously worked in Canada and the US. Now you're in China. So could you talk us through a bit about your experience working in different countries, what you've done, and if there's anything that you think is interesting, worth highlighting?
Sure. I typically call myself as a global citizen for a reason. I was born and raised in China, but I actually went to Singapore for my high school at the age of 16. So that's why it's interesting. I took GCE O-level and A-level in Singapore, but I've never been to UK. So that's maybe one of the fun facts. After that, I went to Canada, like Toronto, to University of Toronto to took my undergraduate education as an electrical engineer. And I went to the States to work, and I've been working in the United States for like 11 years for a company like Microsoft and Square as a software engineer. Interesting aspect there is I never write any single lines of open source code. I've been pretty much working on closed source softwares. But that was all fun. It got me very well trained to be a software engineer. And I decided to go back to China during COVID just to be closer with my family. And I took a job offer from Ant Group because I really love fintech. Like Square was a fintech company, which I really love the mission and vision of the company. And that's how I lead myself into another fintech company called Ant Group, which is the master company of Alipay, which is one of the largest payment network used on the global stage. But when I came back to China, I decided to switch gears to work on something different. So I took a technical strategy job with the company. One of the technical strategy initiatives we built was open source. So for the first year, I've been working on several different projects, but from the second year onward, open source was the only thing I've been working on. It has been a very pleasant journey. It got me to meet with a lot of cool friends like the other Richard sitting next to me, and all these very smart developers in China. It also uses my hybrid skill set of being a software engineer as well as my master MBA degree I got from Berkeley Haas. So it has been 4 years. We grow the team from like a one-man show to like 8 people team now. And the company has been putting open source as a technical strategy. For that, it really kind of makes me feel, I would say, happy and achieved. And since last year, we began doing some of the global outreach and international expansion for open source, which lead us to the state of OpenCon here today. So has been a very great experiences, and I cannot highlight how much I would say blessings I receive along the way, and it's very glad to be here.
So it's quite difficult to monetize open source technology, but of course your job at Ant involved a lot of or has involved a lot of trying to figure out win-win situations of how you can win and your partners, you can win and everyone can win from open source. So how do you design these strategies? How do you design these situations? And could you maybe give us an example of some cool project that you worked on?
Sure. Well, I mean, the laundry list is pretty long, so I will cut. Yeah, I'll cut it short. First thing first, I mean, you nailed the point that when people talk about open source, they talk about open source in conjunction with commercialization. I would say it's neither necessary nor sufficient for open source to be used as a commercial, like to support your commercial engagement. That said, we do believe that open source is a very nice way of helping your go-to-market strategy. If you have a very viable product like a cloud-native technology or operating system or databases in which you can use the open core way to engage your customers, build your developer army, and then to potentially help commercializing your enterprise version of it. So that's definitely one way of using it. But back to your question, how Ant Group perceives open source is we perceive open source as three things. One, we believe open source is a way to build trust because we work in fintech, right? So trust is pretty important. A lot of times, our revenue stream doesn't come directly by selling technical product. So the connection is not really there. But why do we still care about it? It's because, we're selling that to financial institutions. We're selling that to trading platforms, which by themselves has a lot of regulatory requirements. The trust is super important. So if you have our technology to be open source, people will be able to actually see through the code and knowing exactly the quality of the code. It will essentially make our, I would say, adoption much easier. So that's one of our primary focuses why we're doing all of this. And the second part is about branding, right? So if you think about Google is not really selling technology. But when we talk about Google, we all think Google is a technical company. But is Google really a technical company? Theoretically speaking, Google is an advertisement company.
Yes.
But people call Google a technical company for a reason. Is because, first thing first, they have a very solid technology. But why do people know about it? It's because they open source it. And another thing is they have, all the engineers working at Google, at least based on selective sampling, they're very strong engineers. And if you hire an engineer from Google, most likely that, it's a good engineer, which translates into the aspect that, open source is a very interesting way of attracting talent. Because if you have open source technology, it's very easy for people to see that you have good technology and you have a very good environment of sustaining people to build open source technology like Kubernetes, like TensorFlow, as long as the chart, right? So that's why people want to go to a company. In Ant Group, we believe in the same thing. In fact, we've been benefiting from it. So Ant Group has one of the best front-end technology team in China for the longest years, in part because of that. Is we end up building Ant Design, Ant V, and many high-quality open source projects. People see it, and people know the company actually supports that, and that's why they want to come to us. And last but not least, we do believe that open source is going to be beneficial for long-term success for the company in the future. Also, talent was one of them, branding was another one of them. Last but not least, we believe that open source is back to its very fundamental. Open source is a direct reflection of your engineering culture. So as someone have been working in both the States and China, one thing I can tell is engineering culture is really important, but it's very hard to build or sustain. So over the past couple of years, one thing which we're really trying hard to do is we're trying to essentially internally build this kind of ecosystem that people can actually work on open source by either working on our own source projects or by contributing to the popular open source projects like Linux kernel, TensorFlow, Kubernetes, PyTorch. The list is long. So that they gain the skills of becoming better engineer, that they can help other engineers to be better engineer. We made some small progresses over there. Last year we had the internal hackathon. We have internal workshops by really allowing the developers to work on open source project and get rewarded. Last year we had that program running for a year with a master with the master reward of being a PS5. I know, but it works. Yeah, but I mean, like, it's a very long answer to your question. But the way we're kind of looking at it is like, I think open source, if used correctly, can be a very strong utility to help your strategy, as well as your implementation, operations, and developer experiences as an enterprise. The list is really long.
Yeah, we just spoke to Ron from Flux. He's the co-founder and CEO there, and he said the culture points. He also said that point. So this is a common thread, where like the culture built in open source based companies or companies that work in open source a lot is really, really strong. Just cool to see that that happens across borders as well.
Yeah, but for better or for worse, there are also challenges associated with that. Because if you kind of, just ask us a very candid question about how that's going to be measured, right? Are we going to be measuring the number of people participating in open source? That's probably wrong, right? Are we going to be measuring the line of code contributing to open source? That's probably also wrong. So kind of back to like your point, while we all know that's important, but it's also a very challenging point to be made. Almost takes like a decade of effort to get the leadership's buy-in to really understand about your engineering cultures and why such a long-term investment is important.
I think you mentioned the importance of collaboration in open source, and I just wanted to get your thoughts about how we can increase collaboration across borders, because obviously you said the culture is challenging between borders, but I think it would be very good for the open source community if there was like more collaboration. So could you just touch on that, please?
That's a very good question. In fact, I got a similar question from one of the audiences over there. It has something to do with the fact that a lot of the information we're getting from the media nowadays can be biased, right? Especially when across borders or geolocations are concerned. In fact, I mean, if you look at the numbers, China is currently ranking as the number 2 or number 3 in terms of like GitHub contributions and number of developers. We have a lot of smart developers in China, which are really willing to participate and work with the global open source communities. In fact, I mean, they do that anyway. And the global community is probably aware of those developers, but I would say the engagement is not already there. I think there are a couple of things we can really be helpful. First thing first, we should really increase the number of high quality content on the internet, both ways. So for instance, we have this podcast here today. Maybe like one thing which we can really do is like, let's distribute this podcast to the local developers so that they know that the Chinese developers are really willing to work with all of us.
Yeah.
Probably such an avenue doesn't really exist. Or there are channels over there, but we're not being loud enough. If we're not being loud enough, the signal to noise ratio will not really be there. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is like, given we're already post-COVID for like 2 years, and recently China has been changing the visitor policies by allowing visitors to visit the country for not having visa. So I will highly make a call to action to anyone who are interested in this particular area, find a way to join the local community's events or like summits. If you don't know which ones to join, feel free to reach out to me, Richard Bian, and we can share that to you. There are a lot of interesting technical events there, related to all sorts of different projects. If you travel to the Asian Pacific region, be our guest. And that's like the best way to know the country and work with the developers by just like be there and show your face. And you will learn how welcoming the Chinese are. Last but not least, I feel that there has not been enough, I would say, virtual events which are currently being conducted. I'm not sure about OpenUK and our plans, but maybe one thing which we can do and endorse is to make this podcast to be a global podcast. If allowed, maybe you can just like, one thing we can do is like we can maybe run some of these episodes by collaborating with some of the, the local speakers here, and we can translate the whole thing into Mandarin.
Yes.
And deliver the content that way, so that we're facilitating this kind of bi-directional communication and vice versa. In fact, I mean, I personally have been recorded a lot of podcasts in Mandarin, trying to help the developers, being a better global developers by improving their soft skills, like how they're working in the community, how to do asynchronous like communications, and why English skill might not be the most important barrier, because people in the open source communities are really welcoming. Yeah, I would say there's a long road to go, but the fact that you're asking that question today really makes me feel that we're probably more closer to the, I would say, the ultimate communication stage than what I thought, like what I thought. Yeah. So I'm very optimistic about it.
Nice. And just two things to say before we get to the final question. So if any of the listeners do want to contact Richard, we'll put your links in the description down below, so they can figure out maybe what conferences or communities to join. And second, Quan here is also a Mandarin speaker. So maybe I think it would be really nice if we could convert this episode to Mandarin.
Yes,
And
absolutely.
that'd be awesome. Yeah.
Yeah, I heard like you already had a conversation with my friend, the other Richard, in Mandarin. So I mean, that's great, right? This is why I'm kind of thinking that, especially with all the large language models, the language barrier should never be the primary barrier anymore. Yeah, I would say that with toolings and some of the technologies, we're really looking into getting the developers to talk to each other more often, because the developers really know how to speak each other's language, regardless if it's Python, Java, or Rust.
One quick question. So you've worked in lots of different places, different companies, different countries, and everywhere has a different culture and a different attitude and different ways of doing things. And so what have you learned about observing and experiencing all of these different ways? What have you noticed really works well? What's the charm about the different locations?
Wow, that's probably like 30 minutes conversation by itself. I'm trying to cut it down to like maybe 1 minute.
Just the most important things.
Yeah, I would say the context is really important. I would highly recommend a book called like Cultural Map. You can search for that. Another resource which I would recommend is if you go to the embassy website of each of the countries. I've been kind of reading the Canadian embassy website, especially under the Chamber of Commerce. They have like a lot of these recommendations about doing business in different countries. Fabulous. It has all this kind of like very long list about some of the cultural recommendations, forbidden things, not what are things not to say, and like practices and all of this kind of like SOPs. I would highly recommend that. And just from my personal experience, because I call myself a global citizen, one thing which I really love about Singapore and Toronto is really multicultural. By saying multicultural is that people don't talk about culture or race at all.
Yes.
It's engraved or embedded in their day-to-day life. And to some extent that people can actually make some, I would say, stereotypical jokes and nobody will feel offended.
Yeah.
I think that's to me is one of the most important indicator about if the city is really multicultural or not. So that's one thing. The other thing is like one thing I really learned about the education system is there's no best education system on the planet. Because if you reverse engineering it, right, by asking yourself this question, if we assume such a place exists, all the rich people will send their kids there. Did that happen? No. So reversely, you can prove that such a place doesn't exist. So one thing which I really learned that is just as Oldwell saying that when you're in Rome, do as the Romans do, right? One thing which I personally feel to be really beneficial is to experience the culture in an immersive way by really trying the local food, talk to all your friends, come from different races, understand their thought process, be keen and open. Open and growth mindset, to some extent, is one of the most important treasure we have as someone working on open source, right? If you are not open, you should not be working on open source. Yeah, so, and last but not least, if there's one thing which I will actually end my conversation here, is I do believe that, culture is one aspect of it. And the most important aspect is probably the context in terms of communication. If we can pay attention to the high context versus low context culture, cross-cultural collaboration and communication should never be a problem, as long as you're being genuinely curious about what the others are saying by listening, by saying listening, it doesn't mean that I'm just waiting for my turn to speak. It means that I'm really listening to what you say.
Thinking about it.
Yeah, and really kind of processing about it. And that's pretty much how the large language models are doing. I think if the language models can do it, we as human beings should be doing that as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard.
Pleasure talking to you.
So many great insights.
Love this conversation. Thanks so much for offering the opportunity.